Well, back in 2011, the locomotive prior to that had several hot bearing issues and conditions that caused some pretty significant damage to crank pins. So these crank pins were brand new, and at that time we took the rods apart, each one of these rods here, and we made new bushings for the new pins, made new rod hardware, and had that hardware made for us by a firm back east. But at that time, we cleaned everything up. We did a really thorough inspection on the rods to know that they were safe for continued service. You can imagine that the inertia forces and the reciprocating forces of all that weight traveling at speed. So this very critical part of the locomotive, and one of the limiting factors of a locomotive speed is that its ability to stay together. So you've got the counterbalances up in each one of these wheel castings, and it's a tremendous design, a tremendous work of art. Here's the firebox. All these washout plugs are new. We rebuilt, this is known as a blowdown. You can see it's rebuilt internally. Externally, it's the original castings, but internally we machined it out and machined new seats for it. We machined and built up pistons. In some cases, we got new pistons. And this is actually an air cylinder and allows us to operate it from the cab. All of these stay bolts here, from this row up to this row, were all new. So all the bracketing came off, the cab was completely off, and you can see all of these. These are known as stay bolt caps. A lot of people think they're rivets, but they're actually a welded cap for a flexible stay bolt, and that holds the inner firebox sheet to the outer firebox sheet. All the new piping under the cab, just a tremendous amount of work and effort went into the rebuild. This is our safety control system here, all completely rebuilt in-house. And this allows us to interface with the safety control system that's on a portion of the UP network. You can see the fuel valves and other valves and pipes that connect the tender together. We've got a steam heat line so we can heat our fuel. We've got the water line for what we call the water pump. We've got two ways to put water in a steam locomotive. The feed water heater, this is called the cold water turbine. The cold water turbine takes the cold water from the tender and it runs it through a heating chamber. And that heating chamber heats that steam with exhaust steam from the engine. It takes about 15% of that exhaust steam and runs it through an atmosphere of that exhaust steam. And that cold feed water goes down and sprays through that atmosphere, transferring the heat of the exhaust steam and mixing it, and then heating that water where it's stored in a tank and ultimately pumped into the locomotive boiler as needed. The other side of the locomotive, we'll go around and we'll talk about the injector. In between, we have what's called a radial buffer, and that's state-of-the-art 1940s technology. This arrangement right here, you can see the little lubricating line moving up to what's known as a floating chafing block, and there's an adjustment that's required to maintain the right relationship between the engine and tender. Two drawbars down below that connect the engine and tender. We fixed those up back in 2011. We put new drawbar pin bushings in the tender and in the engine, and we made two new drawbar pins. The drawbar pins actually are installed from the bottom, so they go up and in, and there's a big heavy retaining plate that keeps those in there. And there's various fasteners that hold that retaining plate in there so those drawbar pins stay in. So it's all part of our inspection every day, at the end of the day, and throughout the day as we're stopping, we'll go around and we're inspecting all aspects of the locomotive. We make the parts ourselves. Depending on how big it is, some of the components are pretty large, and it's more cost effective for us to have something like that done. But ultimately, we'd like to move to doing a lot of that work in-house. It does two things. One never knows how long some of the capacity for working on steam locomotive is going to remain. So it's just part of a business decision to try to develop as much infrastructure as a business decision would allow you to make. Turning the wheels, for example, and making big components. A lot of that happens so infrequently, it's best just to find another location that has the ability to turn a driver of an 8-inch diameter. Other things we can do ourselves. A drawbar pin is something that we can make. A lot of the hardware we'll make, and that's what the machinists do. They're an actual machinist where they'll set up a pretty complicated machining operation and perform that operation. Some cases it'll take you several days to get your setup made for a 15-minute machining operation, but that's what's required to make an accurate part. We made new piston rings. We had a condition back in 2009 where the locomotive, it's a condition called foaming, and when the locomotive foamed, it broke the rings. And not enough to where we couldn't run, but it did break the ring segments, and that winter when we took the locomotive apart, we found them all crumbled up. It looked like a handful of gravel in the end of the cylinder. So we built the piston up and made new rings for it. We completely made them in-house. So it's fun, it's interesting to make those new parts, but that's what you have to do. Just like in the old days when they had these locomotives, they had to make everything. The primary tender, what we call our primary tender, it's the tender that's connected to the locomotive. It's got 6,200 gallons of fuel oil, and we burn a used motor oil, and 23,000 gallons of water. Behind it, we always carry an auxiliary tender. The auxiliary tender is a tender from the 800 class, and it has the fuel compartment removed. It served in an earlier capacity as a fuel tender for the gas turbine electric locomotives, and now it's an auxiliary tender for the steam program, and it's all water, 28,000 gallons. Between the two tenders, fully fueled, fully watered, we've got a range of right around 300 miles. There are conditions where we will, as we're traveling throughout the day, depending on where we're traveling, parts of the Union Pacific network are former railroads that did not have locomotives of this size. We also have a lot of bridges that have yet to be fully upgraded. So there are conditions and circumstances where we'll have to reduce the weight of water and reduce our speed as we cross those bridges. And that's part of the logistics and the planning part of the trip that I will go through. And that's one of the reasons it takes a long time to release the information to the public. A lot of people are wondering, why is it taking so long to tell us where you're going? Well, we have to make sure and vet all of those circumstances. The public relations side, where we're going to stop. But the biggest thing is the infrastructure planning. And that mainly has to do with bridge condition. As we're traveling to Memphis, we'll be on parts of the former Missouri Pacific, and parts of that railroad have been upgraded to full capacity. There are parts of the railroad that we'll travel on that has structures that are still quite old. The names on the cars and the tenders, they're significant people that have an impact on the program. We have the Art Lockman right back here. Art was a mechanical foreman that had responsibilities for the steam crew. He retired in 1991. He started with the railroad in the 1940s. And in the car right around the corner, we have the Lynn Nystrom. Lynn started his railroad career in the 1970s. And regretfully, we lost Lynn in 2010. Lynn was one of the greatest ambassadors for the Union Pacific Railroad. He served as a locomotive fireman for years and a locomotive engineer for about 5 years before his passing in 2010. Lynn and his wife, Mary Nystrom, ran the souvenir program, which we will again have very soon. So Lynn was, he's remembered by all, and he was a great ambassador for the railroad. You wouldn't find somebody that loved railroading more than Lynn Nystrom. We have the Reed Jackson souvenir car. We don't have that with us, but Reed Jackson was also a member of our crew for many years, and unfortunately he too passed away. And his name is now adorns the side of our souvenir car.